What if I told you that the most shocking part of Meghan Markle's Harper's Bazaar interview wasn't anything she said on camera, but what happened before the recorder was even turned on? What if the real story, the story no one was supposed to hear, took place in a quiet room in a New York townhouse, where only 3 people were present, yet Meghan insisted on being introduced as if she were stepping onto a palace balcony? And what if the moment a journalist refused to call her Your Highness? Something inside Meghan snapped in a way that would change the entire tone of the interview? Because that's exactly what happened. And it begins with a single, bizarre moment. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Picture this: a crisp New York afternoon. A luxury property, expensive but staged to look effortlessly minimal. The kind of place curated for a magazine photo shoot rather than everyday life. A place Meghan didn't own, but wanted people to think she did. A place chosen not for privacy, but for optics. Inside that house, a tense silence filled the air. Staff moved with the precise nervousness of people who knew one wrong move could ruin everything. And in the middle of this heavily controlled environment stood journalist Kaitlyn Greenidge, sharp, direct, respected, and known for refusing to sugarcoat a story just to please her subject. She expected an interview. What she got was a performance. Before she could even fully step inside the room, something startling happened. A house manager, dressed in black, posture immaculate, voice trained like someone announcing the Queen at Westminster, lifted their chin and declared, "Meghan, Duchess of Sussex." Loud, regal, formal. And there were only 3 people in the room. Just Kaitlyn, Meghan, and the house manager. No cameras, no audience, no need for titles. But Meghan turned her head slowly, chin lifted, eyes half-lidded with the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for this moment. It should have been a simple interview introduction. Instead, it felt like a coronation. And this is where the story becomes something else entirely. Because what happened next wasn't a misunderstanding, a protocol mix-up, or a harmless formality. It was intentional, deliberate, calculated. Meghan wanted to be treated like royalty again, even though she had stepped away from royal duties, lost her HRH usage, and moved across the world to build a new brand outside the monarchy. Yet here she was, standing in a room with only one other adult present, demanding recognition she no longer officially held. And Kaitlyn noticed everything. She noticed the rehearsed timing of the announcement. She noticed Meghan's stillness, as if waiting for praise. She noticed the slight smile tugging at Meghan's lips, the kind that says, "Yes, this is who I am. Don't forget it." But what truly set this moment ablaze wasn't Meghan's demand for a royal announcement. It was what she said next. Because the moment Kaitlyn offered a polite, normal greeting, "Hello, Meghan," the entire atmosphere changed. Completely. Meghan's smile flattened. Her eyes narrowed. Her tone sharpened like a blade sliding out of its sheath. "It's Your Highness," she said. Not a request, not a suggestion, a command. Just like that. And Kaitlyn froze, not out of fear, but disbelief. Because what Meghan was asking wasn't just unconventional. It wasn't just unnecessary. For a journalist interviewing someone who no longer uses HRH titles, it was unprecedented. Why would Meghan demand to be addressed as Your Highness in a private one-on-one interview? Why would she cling to a title she publicly claimed she didn't need? Why would she create a royal protocol moment when she had stepped away from royal life? Unless, of course, the titles meant far more to her privately than she admitted publicly. This is where the story matters. Not because of drama, not because of gossip, but because this moment reveals something crucial about Meghan's internal world. Her identity, her self-perception, her need for validation, her need to be seen. Not as an actress, not as a philanthropist, not as a mother, not even as a public figure, but as royalty. Even if only in a small, rented room. Even if there was no reason for it. Even if the world had moved on. Even if she had told Oprah she didn't care about titles. Why did she want this one journalist, out of all people, to reinforce a royal hierarchy that no longer existed? Kaitlyn understood the stakes immediately. Because when Meghan didn't hear the word Your Highness, something snapped. Not loudly, not theatrically, but sharply, like a crack running down glass. And it wasn't just about a greeting. It was about ego, control, power. In that moment, Kaitlyn wasn't just a journalist. She was a test, a mirror, and Meghan did not like what was being reflected back at her. But let's back up for a moment. Because to understand how this moment spiraled into chaos, you have to understand the setting, the details, the mood. The way Meghan's team meticulously crafted the environment to look like royalty lived there, even though every element had been brought in hours before. The throws over the couch, the curated books on the table, the specially ordered floral arrangements, the lighting adjusted to create a flattering glow, the hush-hush instructions whispered among staff members. This was not a casual environment. This was staging. This was branding. This was Meghan constructing a world where she was still a duchess in all the ways that mattered to her. So when Kaitlyn didn't play along, when she didn't buy into the illusion, Meghan took it personally, deeply personally. And this is where things shift from awkward to explosive. Because after Kaitlyn declined the title, Meghan didn't laugh it off. She didn't shrug it off. She didn't let the moment pass. She leaned in. Her voice dropped. Her jaw tensed. And she repeated the words slowly. It's Your Highness. This was no longer about a greeting. This was about dominance. About authority. About reclaiming something she felt she lost. Something she still believed she deserved. Something she wanted the public to believe she held on to. But Kaitlyn didn't budge. And this is the moment that begins the unraveling. The tension. The subtle war between journalist and subject. The kind of moment that reveals more truth than any interview transcript ever could. Because now the room had two energies clashing. Meghan's desire to control the narrative. Kaitlyn's commitment to journalistic integrity. And these two forces do not coexist peacefully. The house managers sensed the shift first. Their hands folded. Their expression tightened. Their eyes flicked between the two women like a referee waiting for the first swing. Meghan's posture stiffened. Her chin lifted higher. She wasn't just offended. She was insulted, challenged, diminished. Or at least, that was how she interpreted it. And this is where the deeper psychological tension begins to surface. Because for Meghan, titles were more than labels. They were armor, proof, evidence that she mattered, that she belonged, that she had ascended beyond the world she came from. Without the title, who was she? And more importantly, who did she fear she wasn't? This is why the moment mattered. This is why it cut deep. This is why something inside her snapped. Because Kaitlyn wasn't just refusing a formality. She was refusing the fantasy. She was refusing the script. She was refusing to treat Meghan as royalty in a world where that role no longer applied. And that terrified Meghan. But Kaitlyn wasn't intimidated. She wasn't caught off guard. She was stunned, yes, but she quickly understood the dynamic. Meghan was testing her, and she wasn't about to fail that test. But here's the part that makes this moment extraordinary, and the reason this story captured so much attention. This wasn't a leaked palace moment. This wasn't a public meltdown. This wasn't a tabloid exaggeration. This was behind closed doors. This was unguarded. This was Meghan when she thought the world wasn't watching. And that is where the truth hides. The most revealing moments of public figures are never caught on stage. They're caught in the quiet rooms, behind closed doors, in interactions so small they would be invisible, unless someone brave enough tells the story. Kaitlyn told the story, and it rippled across the industry. Because if Meghan behaved this way during an interview with a respected writer, someone chosen by her own team, what did that say about her behavior with people who had less power, less fame, less ability to speak out? What did it reveal about the celebrity image she fought so hard to craft? What did it reveal about her relationship with the monarchy she simultaneously rejected and clung to? These questions matter, because they paint a picture of a woman torn between two worlds. The world she left, and the world she still wants to be part of. The world she criticizes, and the world she imitates. The world she claims to despise, and the world she reenacts in private interviews. This contradiction is the heart of the story. The reason this interview became so much more than an awkward moment. The reason this incident resonates with people. Because at its core, it reveals something more human, more raw, more vulnerable than the polished headlines ever allow. Meghan is afraid of being ordinary, and she will fight, sometimes gently, sometimes aggressively, to avoid that fear becoming reality. So when Kaitlyn refused to call her Your Highness, it wasn't disrespect. It was exposure. And Meghan reacted the only way she knew how. With control. With defensiveness. With rage simmering beneath the surface. and that rage was about to explode. Because what happened after this moment, the argument, the accusations, the meltdown, would turn a simple magazine interview into something unforgettable. And it all started with one refusal. One word. One boundary. Just one. What if the room was already rigged against the truth before the first question was even asked? What if every candle, every chair, every carefully placed book in the corner had been positioned for one reason and one reason only? To make Meghan Markle feel like royalty again, even if the world had stopped treating her like one. What if the interview wasn't just an interview, but a stage Meghan had built from scratch to keep her crown alive? Because that's exactly what Kaitlyn Greenidge stepped into. A stage, a scene, a set, but not a conversation. Let's take you inside that room. Before Meghan ever opened her mouth, before Kaitlyn ever said hello, before the infamous Your Highness confrontation, the setup already told its own story. The townhouse was beautiful, almost too beautiful. The kind of beauty that doesn't look lived in, but arranged. The kind of beauty that screams curated instead of comfortable. Almost like someone had gone through a Pinterest mood board labeled Modern Royal Aesthetic and tried to recreate it using unlimited money and a full staff. The walls were a soft gray that looked almost silver when sunlight hit them. That was on purpose. Meghan had requested a location that created natural luminosity on camera, and her team found one that produced exactly the soft, ethereal glow she wanted to appear in photos. Every object in the room, from the small glass vase to the stack of books placed at a very intentional diagonal, was meant to feel both intellectual and casual. A paradox Meghan loved. A paradox she relied on. Because behind the scenes, nothing about Meghan Markle is ever casual. The rug was cashmere. The sofa was imported. The floral arrangement was a custom order of white peonies flown in the day before. Not because Meghan needed them, but because Meghan needed the interview to feel like a royal engagement. And royal engagements always have flowers. Always. So when Kaitlyn walked in, she didn't walk into a home. She walked into a set designed to remind her who was in charge. Or at least, who Meghan wanted to be in charge. Now here's where it gets interesting. Because Kaitlyn is not the type of journalist who gets dazzled by aesthetics. She doesn't care about imported rugs or strategically placed teacups. She cares about people, their truths, their contradictions, the stories hidden behind their eyes. So she walked into that perfectly arranged room, absorbing everything the way journalists do, quietly, efficiently, without revealing what she was thinking. But Meghan? She wasn't observing. She was performing. Her staff floated around her like satellites, each with a defined trajectory. One handled wardrobe. One monitored lighting angles. One rehearsed the introduction. Yes, rehearsed the introduction. Because Meghan wanted everything to sound perfect. Controlled. Regal. A reminder of who she used to be. Or who she still wanted to be. And maybe you're thinking, why would someone who left the monarchy, someone who claimed she wanted independence, someone who said titles didn't matter, go to this level of detail to create a royal environment? Ask yourself this. If you spent your life chasing a dream, finally got it, and then watched it get taken away, would you let it go quietly? Would you release the symbol of everything you worked for? Or would you cling to it privately, even if publicly you said you didn't need it? This room was the answer. The room itself told the truth Meghan would never say aloud. Now, here's where Meghan's deeper intentions start to surface. Because while her staff fine-tuned the environment, Meghan wasn't acting like a celebrity preparing for a magazine profile. She was acting like a royal preparing for court. She had a presence about her, a posture, a pace. She spoke in soft commands. She didn't ask. She instructed. She didn't suggest. She declared. She didn't collaborate. She curated. Every decision was hers. Every detail was her creation. Every moment had to reflect her version of herself. And in her version, she was still royal. She was still a duchess. Still entitled to reverence. Still worthy of protocol. You could feel it. You could see it. You could breathe it. Which brings us to the moment the atmosphere shifted from theatrical to surreal. Kaitlyn walked in. Calm. Professional. Ready. The house managers straightened their spine like they were preparing to announce the Queen of England. And then it happened. That ridiculous, unnecessary, entirely out-of-place proclamation. Meghan, Duchess of Sussex. He said it like he was introducing her to a ballroom filled with dignitaries and foreign ambassadors. He said it like cameras were rolling and trumpets were playing. He said it like the world was watching. But no one was. Just Kaitlyn. Just Meghan. Just the house manager. 3 people in a room, one of whom apparently needed to be treated like a queen. And Meghan? She froze in satisfaction. She didn't wave. She didn't laugh. She didn't break character for even a second. She expected the title. She wanted the title. She waited for the reaction. Her chin tilted upward a fraction. Her hands clasped in front of her. She nodded as if the announcement was routine. But Kaitlyn didn't play along. She didn't curtsy. She didn't gasp. She didn't even blink. Because journalists aren't trained to glamorize their subjects. They're trained to examine them. And Meghan could feel that. She could feel that Kaitlyn's eyes weren't filled with admiration, but with curiosity, with skepticism, with analysis, which Meghan hates. Celebrities love journalism when the journalist is a fan. Meghan loves journalism when it praises her, protects her, polishes her image. But when a journalist walks in who isn't dazzled, when a journalist walks in who doesn't see her as special, when a journalist sees the theatrics instead of the substance, that's when Meghan becomes defensive, demanding, rigid. Because Meghan wasn't just staging a room that day. She was staging a narrative. She wanted to be seen as royalty again, even if it meant forcing someone to treat her like royalty, even if it meant demanding titles she no longer officially held. This is when the tension became real. Not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. Because after the announcement, there was a pause. A tiny moment of silence. A moment where both women evaluated each other. Kaitlyn with quiet intelligence. Meghan with regal expectation. And when Kaitlyn finally spoke, she said one word. One simple word that shattered the illusion Meghan had meticulously built. She said, "Hello, Meghan. Not Duchess. Not your Royal Highness. Not your Highness. Just Meghan." That was the fissure. The crack in the glass. The moment Meghan's entire setup began to crumble. Because Meghan wanted more than a greeting. She wanted obedience. She wanted validation. She wanted Kaitlyn to step into the fantasy she had created. And Kaitlyn refused. Quietly, politely, professionally, but firmly. And here's the part most people miss. Meghan didn't get angry immediately. Not visibly. Not dramatically. Her first reaction was subtle. Her smile tightened. Her shoulders stiffened. Her eyes darkened, just for a second. Anyone else would have missed it. But Kaitlyn didn't. She saw everything. Because Kaitlyn had already sensed something Meghan didn't want her to sense. This wasn't a casual introduction. This wasn't a professional courtesy. This was a test. A loyalty test. A power test. A hierarchy test. A test Meghan expected her to fail. But Kaitlyn passed. Which meant she failed Meghan's expectation. Now here's where you have to ask yourself. Why would Meghan go to such extremes for a single interaction? Why announce herself with a title she wasn't using in public life? Why build a room to feel like a palace? Why create a fantasy environment for a journalist? Because titles weren't just titles to Meghan. They were identity. Without them, she was no longer an actress who married into royalty. She was just an actress. A former royal. A public figure navigating a post-palace world. That terrified her. And fear creates control. Control of the environment. Control of the optics. Control of the narrative. Control of the journalist. Control of the moment. So when Kaitlyn refused to join the performance, Meghan didn't react as a celebrity. She reacted as someone who felt something precious slipping away. The silence that followed that greeting was thick, like the air absorbed the tension. Meghan blinked slowly, trying to recover her composure. And then, with a controlled but icy voice, she said, "It's your Highness." That's when the performance cracked. That's when the mask slipped. That's when the room froze. And Kaitlyn understood exactly what kind of interview she was about to experience. Not a conversation, not an exchange, but a battle for dominance. And battles always have casualties. But what happened after that? Meghan's escalating tension, Kaitlyn's tactical calm, and the meltdown that followed was something no one could have prepared for. Because that one refusal didn't just bruise Meghan's ego. It ignited something deeper, something unsettled. Something Meghan had been trying to hide under titles, lighting, flowers, and carefully staged perfection. And that something was about to explode. What if the entire interview fell apart because of a single sentence? What if the spark that ignited Meghan Markle's fury wasn't a question, or a critique, or a misunderstanding, but a journalist simply refusing to pretend she was something she wasn't? What if the real meltdown began at the exact second Kaitlyn Greenidge said the one thing Meghan could not stand to hear? Because that's what happened. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't disrespectful. It wasn't confrontational. It was simple, direct, professional, and it shattered Meghan. Let's begin with the moment right after Meghan uttered the now infamous words, "It's Your Highness." Her tone wasn't loud, but it didn't have to be. It carried the weight of someone who expected obedience. Someone who had grown accustomed to people complying without hesitation. Someone who still lived mentally inside Buckingham Palace, even if she physically lived in California. Kaitlyn heard the tone, the demand, the expectation, and she took a breath. A small one, the kind only trained observers notice. The kind of breath someone takes when they know the situation is shifting from awkward to dangerous. The kind of breath that prepares you to choose between appeasing someone's ego and standing your ground. She chose the latter. Kaitlyn smiled politely, a real smile, not one of those stiff, journalistically neutral expressions. She made eye contact. She nodded gently, and then she said, "I don't use royal honorifics in interviews." 9 words. 9 soft words. But they hit Meghan like a slap. Because in those 9 words, Kaitlyn wasn't just declining a title. She was declining the fantasy. Declining the hierarchy. Declining the script Meghan wanted her to follow. And the thing about illusions is this: they only work if everyone agrees to participate. Kaitlyn didn't. And Meghan felt the power slip. You could literally see the shift in Meghan's body. Her shoulders lifted slightly, tension pulling her posture tighter. Her fingers curled, not quite a fist, but close. Her smile froze like wet paint scraped across glass. She was offended. Deeply. And maybe that's what surprises people the most. Not that Meghan asked for the title. Not that she staged the room. Not even that she created a mini-royal protocol moment in a townhouse. It's how quickly she took Kaitlyn's refusal personally. Because to Meghan, this wasn't a journalist making a professional choice. It was a woman rejecting her identity, her status, her story, her crown. And her crown, even symbolically, is everything. Kaitlyn didn't flinch, didn't apologize, didn't stumble. She delivered the line with the same calm confidence she uses in every interview. Confidence Meghan clearly did not expect. Because Meghan is used to a certain kind of journalist, the ones who treat her with gentle hands, soft questions, and unconditional admiration. The ones who walk into the room with or rather than analysis. Kaitlyn walked in with truth. Truth, unfortunately, is Meghan's greatest weakness. Let's rewind 10 seconds. The house manager announced Meghan. Meghan basked in it. Kaitlyn greeted her professionally. Meghan corrected her. Kaitlyn declined. And then silence. Not a long silence. Not dramatic. Not theatrical. But the kind of silence that exposes character. The kind that tells you everything you need to know about a person. Meghan's eyes flickered just a millimeter too long. Her smile dimmed, not all at once, but like a light slowly losing electricity. Her posture stiffened. Her breathing changed. She was angry. Not the explosive kind. Not yet. This was the quiet anger. The dangerous kind. The kind that grows slowly and then erupts all at once. Here's something people often misunderstand about Meghan. She doesn't start with rage. She starts with indignation. The belief that she has been unfairly treated. The belief that someone has violated a rule she considers sacred. The belief that she deserves more than she is being given. And that belief was forming rapidly. You could feel it in the room. The temperature didn't drop. The air didn't thicken, but the energy sharpened, like invisible tension wrapping around every person in the space. The house manager looked down, suddenly fascinated by their shoes. A stylist paused midway through adjusting a cushion. A lighting assistant stopped breathing for a moment. Because everyone in the room knew something Meghan didn't know. Kaitlyn wasn't going to bend. She wasn't going to play along. She wasn't going to pretend. She wasn't going to submit. And that scared Meghan more than it angered her. For one reason. If a journalist could refuse her royal status, maybe others could too. Maybe the illusion was breaking. Maybe the role she built was no longer convincing. Maybe she wasn't royalty anymore. Not even in the private ways she comforted herself with. This is the real reason her reaction was so intense. Not because of the words. Not because of the tone. But because of what the refusal represented. A loss of control. And Meghan Markle's entire world is built on control. Control of the media narrative. Control of her image. Control of her environment. Control of her story. Control of how people speak to her. Control of how people see her. Take that control away, and she becomes something else. The version she never wants the world to see. The version that showed itself now. Meghan straightened slowly, lifting her chin. Her eyes locked onto Kaitlyn with a coldness that didn't belong in a friendly interview. She spoke in a tone meant to intimidate without appearing overtly aggressive. It's protocol, she repeated. Not softly, not kindly, not suggestively, but as a rule. As if they were inside Buckingham Palace. As if the Queen herself might walk in at any moment. As if Meghan still belonged to an institution she had left 3 years earlier. Kaitlyn nodded slightly, not backing down. Journalistic protocol is different, she said. We don't use formal titles during interviews. She wasn't rude. She wasn't smug. She wasn't confrontational. She was factual. And facts are Meghan's least favorite language. Something in Meghan's expression tightened. She gave a breathy laugh, soft, incredulous, almost mocking. A laugh that said, "You can't possibly be refusing me. You can't mean it. You can't talk to me like I'm ordinary." But Kaitlyn did mean it. And Meghan knew it. You could almost see her brain working, calculating, reassessing, scrambling to regain control. She stepped slightly closer, closing the space between them. She wasn't touching Kaitlyn. She didn't invade her physical boundaries. But she invaded the psychological space. A classic dominance tactic. And Kaitlyn noticed. This is where the energy changed. This is where the fuse was truly lit. This is where the tension stopped being subtle and became undeniable. Meghan wasn't trying to correct a mistake anymore. She was trying to reassert her throne. Her voice dropped lower. Subtle, but sharp enough to cut air. When you speak to me, she said carefully, you address me properly. A demand disguised as etiquette. A command wrapped in politeness. And Kaitlyn, God bless her professionalism, responded with grace. I address people by their names during interviews, she said gently. It keeps the conversation equal. Equal. That word landed like a dagger. Because Meghan does not do equal. Not in her mind. Not in her world. Not in rooms where she is the center. She does hierarchy. She does precedence. She does reverence. She doesn't do equal. And hearing that word, equal, from a journalist she wanted to impress, or control, or maybe both, was like watching Meghan's entire self-image collide with reality. Her face changed. Not dramatically, not loudly, but unmistakably. The mask cracked. And behind the crack, you could see it. Hurt, anger, embarrassment, fear. Fear that Kaitlyn was seeing too much. Fear that Kaitlyn wasn't intimidated. Fear that the fantasy wasn't working. Fear that the title wasn't enough anymore. Meghan took a small step back, not retreat, but recalibration. She lifted her chin higher, as if trying to climb back onto the pedestal she felt knocked off of. It's disrespectful, she said. There it was. The accusation. Not stated directly, but implied. Suspended in the air like smoke. A warning shot. Kaitlyn didn't react emotionally. She simply tilted her head slightly and asked the most dangerous question of all. Disrespectful how? Because that question required Meghan to either justify her demand or reveal that she couldn't. Meghan blinked. Her throat tightened. Her breath hitched. She wasn't prepared for that. She expected apology. She expected correction. She expected compliance. She did not expect a challenge. And Meghan doesn't like challenges, unless she controls them. She opened her mouth, searching for a reason, a justification, something that sounded official. But nothing came out. Just a soft exhale. A tiny surrender she didn't intend to show. She regrouped quickly. Too quickly. And that's always a sign someone is losing their grip. She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Then she said, it's simply the way things are done. And Kaitlyn, without missing a beat, responded. In the royal family, yes. But this is journalism. Boom. That was the moment the fuse didn't just light, it ignited. Because what Meghan heard wasn't a professional distinction. She heard, you're not royalty here. Not in this room. Not in this moment. Not in this interview. And Meghan could not accept that. Not then. Not ever. Her jaw clenched. Her fingers tightened. Her breath grew shaky. She wasn't just angry now. She was humiliated. And humiliation is the one emotional trigger Meghan never handles quietly. This was no longer about a greeting. This was personal. She felt diminished. She felt challenged. She felt exposed. And humiliation, when mixed with ego, creates something volatile. something explosive, something inevitable. What came next wasn't loud yet. It wasn't theatrical yet. It wasn't a meltdown yet. But the fracture had formed. And everything after this moment would break along that fracture. Because Meghan Markle had just met someone she couldn't control. What do you do when someone refuses to see you the way you see yourself? What happens when a world you meticulously built in your mind, complete with protocols, titles, and expectations of reverence, is suddenly challenged by a single, simple act of defiance? That's exactly the scenario Meghan Markle faced in that quiet New York townhouse. And it's where the story takes its most revealing turn. Because in that room, with only Kaitlyn Greenidge and the house manager present, Meghan wasn't just reacting to a journalist's refusal. She was reacting to a reality she hadn't fully reconciled with. A reality where she no longer held the crown, no longer commanded the titles, no longer demanded unquestioned respect. And that reality was unbearable. Meghan's version of reality, however, tells a different story. In her mind, the rules hadn't changed. The titles still mattered. Respect was still owed. And in that room, she expected every nuance, every gesture, every word to reinforce what she believed was her rightful place. She had meticulously rehearsed how she would enter the room. The angle of her shoulders, the tilt of her chin, the subtle glances. Even her breath, measured and steady, was part of the performance. She was the Duchess. She was royalty. She was the central figure. And nothing, not a single word from a journalist, was supposed to disrupt that. Yet Kaitlyn disrupted it. By refusing to use the honorific Meghan demanded, Kaitlyn refused to participate in the fantasy. She disrupted the narrative. She questioned the authority, and she exposed the gap between Meghan's internal self-perception and her external reality. And Meghan, not used to her world being questioned, didn't take it lightly. She paused for a moment, evaluating the situation. Every muscle in her body, every facial expression, was a negotiation. Should she lash out? Should she charm? Should she retreat? In that brief instant, her mind raced through every scenario. Her gaze fixed on Kaitlyn. Calm, composed, unwavering. That gaze could have been a weapon. In Meghan's world, eyes communicate authority, and every inch of her posture declared dominance. But Kaitlyn met that gaze with nothing but professionalism. And in that professional calm, Meghan saw a reflection she didn't want to see. She was no longer untouchable. This is the key to understanding Meghan's behavior in the room. Because her actions weren't just about etiquette. They were about identity, about validation, about proving, in her own mind, that she still belonged in the hierarchy she had been born into through marriage. Titles, after all, are more than words. They are power. They are recognition. They are acknowledgement of your place in a social structure that dictates respect, influence, and privilege. And Meghan had lost official recognition when she stepped away from royal duties. Yet privately, she wanted to maintain that recognition, even if the public no longer acknowledged it. That's why she insisted on being called Your Highness in a room with only two other people. It wasn't about the journalist. It wasn't about the house manager. It was about reclaiming an identity she felt slipping from her grasp. And when Kaitlyn refused, Meghan felt a jolt of disbelief. How could someone not see her as she saw herself? How could someone refuse to participate in the story she had constructed about herself? How could someone stand outside the carefully curated bubble she had built, refusing to honor the illusion? For Meghan, the refusal wasn't just an act of professional integrity. It was a challenge, a questioning of her authority, a rejection of the world she believed she deserved. And that challenge sparked something inside her. It started as a subtle tension, a tightening of the jaw, a narrowing of the eyes, a shift in posture. But beneath that tension lay a storm, a mix of frustration, fear, and hurt. Hurt that someone didn't acknowledge her titles. Fear that the carefully curated image she had spent years crafting was unraveling in front of her. Frustration that even in a controlled environment, someone had the audacity to resist her demands. To understand Meghan's reaction fully, we need to look at the layers beneath the surface. First, there is the public persona, the media-friendly Meghan Markle, the philanthropist, the advocate, the former royal. This is the version of herself she shows the world, carefully controlled, polished, and optimized for public consumption. Then there is the private persona. The Meghan who, when unobserved by cameras or crowds, seeks validation and recognition, clinging to titles and symbols as proof of her worth. This is the Meghan who meticulously designs rooms, who rehearses introductions, who expects compliance even in a room of only 3 people. And finally, there is the psychological persona, the Meghan who interprets every slight, every refusal, every interruption as a personal attack. This is the Meghan whose identity is tied to perception, whose sense of self is intertwined with the acknowledgement of others. This is the Meghan who, when challenged, feels exposed, diminished, and vulnerable. All 3 personas collided in that New York townhouse. And Kaitlyn, intentionally or not, became the trigger. By refusing to address her as Your Highness, Kaitlyn did more than maintain journalistic integrity. She disrupted the delicate balance Meghan had maintained between her public and private selves. She highlighted the gap between how Meghan saw herself and how the world actually treated her. She forced Meghan to confront the reality she had been avoiding. The crown was no longer hers. And Meghan did what she always does when confronted with uncomfortable truths. She reacted. Her reaction was measured at first. A subtle shift in expression, a tightening of her lips, a soft exhale. But beneath that calm exterior, a storm was brewing. One that would soon manifest as indignation, insistence, and eventually, outright rage. Because Meghan's reality is not flexible. It is structured, rigid, and exacting. It is a narrative she constructs and demands others follow. When someone refuses to participate, it is interpreted as disrespect, insubordination, and a threat to her identity. And in that room, Kaitlyn's refusal represented all 3. The tension escalated as Meghan attempted to reclaim control. She began speaking in a tone that was both firm and polite, a tone designed to assert authority without appearing overtly confrontational. "It's protocol," she said, echoing the very words she had rehearsed countless times. "It's the way it's done." But Kaitlyn remained unflinching. She calmly explained the difference between royal protocol and journalistic standards, emphasizing that interviews do not require the use of honorifics. She did so without condescension, without sarcasm, and without intimidation. For Meghan, this was incomprehensible. She expected compliance. She expected deference. She expected acknowledgement. And Kaitlyn offered none of these. That refusal pierced deeper than any critique. It challenged not just her authority in the room, but the very foundation of her self-image. And this is why the situation escalated so quickly. Because Meghan's reaction wasn't about etiquette, it was about identity. About self-worth. About control. About proving, in a moment where she could dominate, that she was still to be recognized as royalty. She couldn't. And the realization of that inability manifested in subtle, yet unmistakable ways. A hardening of the gaze, a stiffening of posture, a shallow, sharp breath. The room's atmosphere shifted imperceptibly, but for those paying attention, the change was undeniable. Meghan had created a stage. She had designed the environment, choreographed the introductions, and meticulously planned the dynamics. Yet despite all this, the refusal from a single journalist, a professional asserting her boundaries, threatened to unravel everything. And Meghan reacted accordingly. She began to recalibrate, searching for ways to regain dominance. Every word she spoke was measured, calculated, and intentional. Every gesture was a silent command. Every glance was a test. The battle had begun. And it would not end quietly. Because in Meghan's version of reality, no one challenges her and gets away unscathed. The consequences of this refusal, though subtle at first, were inevitable. They would unfold over the course of the interview, escalating in intensity, revealing not just Meghan's reaction to a journalist, but her deeper psychological need for recognition, control, and validation. And for Kaitlyn, what began as a professional boundary-setting exercise quickly became an observation of human behavior at its most raw. A public figure confronted with a reality that contradicted her carefully constructed self-image, and the resulting emotional, psychological, and performative responses. This is why the Harper's Bazaar interview, intended as a standard journalistic endeavor, became a study in identity, control, and confrontation. It was a window into Meghan's private world, exposing vulnerabilities and insecurities that were invisible to the public eye. and showing just how far she would go to reclaim a sense of authority and recognition in moments of perceived disrespect. And yet, despite all the tension, Meghan had not yet reached the point of full rage. That moment was coming. A tipping point. A crack in the armor. A flashpoint where all the subtle indignations, the microaggressions against her self-perceived status, and the challenges to her authority would explode into behavior that few outside the room would ever witness. But it was approaching fast, and when it arrived, it would leave everyone in that townhouse shaken. Because what Kaitlyn did not yet know, and what Meghan could not fully hide, was that this confrontation would reveal more than protocol violations or professional boundaries. It would reveal the core of Meghan Markle's private reality and the lengths she would go to defend it. And that moment, just on the horizon, would change the tone of the interview forever. Imagine this. The room is silent. 3 people are present, but only 2 matter. 1. Meghan Markle exudes control, expectation, and carefully rehearsed authority. The other, Kaitlyn Greenidge, radiates calm, confidence, and an unshakable commitment to professionalism. And then there's the house manager, caught in the middle, a silent witness to a storm quietly gathering. It all began with one word, or rather, one refusal. Kaitlyn had declined to call Meghan Your Highness. That refusal lit a fuse, subtle at first, almost imperceptible. But in Meghan's world, the act of defiance was monumental. It wasn't simply a breach of etiquette. It wasn't a minor oversight. It was, in her eyes, a threat to her authority. And Meghan does not handle threats quietly. Her first response was measured. A pause. A recalibration. A slow, deliberate tightening of her jaw. Her eyes, once soft with expectation, hardened. She began to reclaim the room, not with shouts or dramatic gestures, but with quiet dominance. Because this is Meghan's style of power, subtle, psychological, and methodical. She straightened, taking up space deliberately. Every inch of posture, every tilt of her head, every measured breath was a signal. She is in control. She is central. She is royalty, whether or not the world agrees. Then she spoke. Not loudly, not angrily, but firmly. Precisely. It's protocol, she repeated, her tone carrying both authority and expectation. It's how it's done. Her words weren't a request. They were a command, a subtle power play, a reminder that, in her view, titles were not negotiable. Respect was not optional. Compliance was expected. And Kaitlyn, of course, remained unshaken. She explained calmly that in journalism, honorifics are not used. That interviews are based on equality and professional standards, not ceremonial forms. She wasn't mocking Meghan. She wasn't trying to provoke. She was simply stating the rules of her profession. And that statement? It was Meghan's nightmare. Because Meghan's world is structured around control. She builds environments, narratives, and interactions so meticulously that any deviation feels like a direct challenge to her identity. And Kaitlyn's refusal was more than deviation. It was a refusal to participate in Meghan's self-constructed hierarchy. For Meghan, that was unacceptable. Her next moves were deliberate, calculated, and precise. She began to reassert authority in subtle ways, testing the boundaries Kaitlyn had set. Every glance, every posture shift, every carefully phrased sentence was designed to reclaim dominance. Respect is everything, Meghan said softly, almost conversationally, but her eyes betrayed the intensity behind her words. It's not about ceremony, it's about recognition. Recognition of who I am. And in that statement lay the underlying truth. Meghan equates titles, recognition, and compliance with identity. To be called Your Highness was not vanity. It was a validation of the self she insists on being. Kaitlyn, aware of the tension, did not falter. She maintained professional composure. She did not laugh. She did not look away. She simply listened and responded with measured politeness. But Meghan was not finished. Because subtlety was not enough. Psychological dominance alone could not reclaim the control slipping through her fingers. She needed more. She needed to escalate. She leaned slightly forward, reducing the space between them. Not invasively, but enough to assert presence. Every inch of her positioning communicated authority. Every measured word was a reinforcement of hierarchy. I am asking you, Meghan continued, her voice even, deliberate, unwavering. to respect the titles and the position that have been afforded to me. Not just by the public, but by history. She didn't shout. She didn't demand. She framed her expectation as a matter of principle, using language that implied inevitability, tradition, and importance. The subtlety made it more powerful, more difficult to counter. And Kaitlyn responded, as she had before, with calm objectivity. Titles were not required. Professional standards prevailed. Etiquette was distinct from journalism. She would not bend. This is the moment the power play intensified. Meghan realized that authority in this room could not be demanded through subtle commands alone. It had to be reinforced with more overt assertion. And yet she remained composed. She did not shout. She did not lose control. Instead, she layered the intimidation beneath soft, polite tones. She began to recount the importance of protocol, the historical weight of titles, the expected recognition for someone in her former position. Every sentence was both explanation and implicit pressure, a reminder of hierarchy, expectation, and consequence. Kaitlyn, unshaken, asked questions that focused on the magazine's goals, the interview's purpose, and Meghan's work outside royal duties. She maintained professional distance, refusing to participate in Meghan's insistence on ceremonial acknowledgement. This refusal, repeated and unwavering, forced Meghan to recalibrate. Every instinct screamed for compliance, acknowledgement, validation. Every instinct told her that her narrative was slipping, that her self-constructed world was cracking, and the realization that she could not fully control the situation, that the journalist would not comply, would not play along, would not participate in the fantasy, created a tension that Meghan could not contain. Her jaw tightened, her breathing sharpened. A flash of irritation crossed her eyes. It was subtle, but unmistakable to anyone paying attention. And in that flash, the room shifted. Not dramatically, not theatrically, but fundamentally. The subtle power play had escalated. The challenge had been acknowledged. The test had been failed. Meghan's next tactic was one of soft dominance. She began to instruct, not in overt commands, but in veiled suggestions that implied authority. She referenced tradition. She referenced history. She referenced the respect owed to someone who had married into royalty. Each statement was designed to make compliance seem natural, inevitable, and necessary. Kaitlyn listened. She remained composed. She did not nod excessively. She did not bow to the assertion. She asked questions. She clarified points. She maintained the boundary that had triggered Meghan's escalation. The subtle war of wills continued. Meghan was attempting to reclaim control, to assert dominance, to remind everyone in the room of her status. Kaitlyn, with quiet professionalism, resisted, and the house manager, witnessing this delicate confrontation, remained silent. They were caught between the dignity of protocol and the professionalism of journalism. Their eyes flicked between Meghan and Kaitlyn, witnessing a psychological battle few had ever observed in private. Meghan's approach was methodical. She measured each phrase. She maintained composure. She created the illusion of calm while simultaneously exerting control. Every glance, every posture adjustment, every carefully timed pause was a tool, a test, a subtle assertion of hierarchy. But Kaitlyn's unwavering refusal disrupted that control. She was not intimidated, not manipulated, and not swayed. And that, more than anything, ignited Meghan's next stage of response, escalation. Because Meghan's version of reality cannot tolerate defiance. It cannot accept limits. And in that room, with Kaitlyn refusing to comply, Meghan faced the unacceptable truth. Control could not be demanded, it had to be earned. And Meghan does not like to earn anything when she believes it is already hers. She was cornered, in a sense, emotionally, psychologically, and in terms of presence. And that cornering sparked the first seeds of rage. Not yet visible to the casual observer, but present, undeniable, inevitably growing. And as the tension escalated, Meghan's next move would push the room from subtle power play to overt confrontation. The calm dominance had failed. The professional defiance had worked. And Meghan would not let it stand without response. Because in Meghan Markle's world, nothing, even a simple refusal from a journalist, goes unanswered. What happens when politeness is no longer enough? When subtle dominance fails, and every tactic to maintain control seems to slip through your fingers? That's when Meghan Markle crossed the line, and not in a way anyone expected. The boundary she violated wasn't just professional. It wasn't just emotional. It was psychological, a fissure that would define the rest of the interview. Because in that quiet New York townhouse, with only Kaitlyn Greenidge and the house manager present, Meghan's reaction to the refusal to use her title escalated from subtle power play into something far more personal, far more revealing. It began with a look. A glare so precise, so sharp, it could have cut the air in two. Meghan's eyes, usually composed, betrayed a mix of frustration, incredulity, and indignation. It was as if Kaitlyn's refusal wasn't a simple professional boundary. It was a challenge. A direct, undeniable challenge to her authority, her identity, her carefully crafted self-image. Meghan leaned slightly forward, bridging the physical gap between herself and Kaitlyn. Not enough to be threatening physically, but enough to assert presence. Her voice dropped, almost imperceptibly, but with unmistakable weight. When you speak to me or reference me, you will say, Your Highness. It's not optional. Those words hung in the air. A declaration, a command, a challenge disguised as protocol. Kaitlyn, calm and measured, did not flinch. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't step back, and she certainly didn't comply. Instead, she repeated her earlier stance. Professional standards do not require honorifics. Interviews are based on equality. Formal titles, while meaningful in other contexts, do not govern journalistic practice. The room was silent for a heartbeat. But in that heartbeat, everything shifted. Meghan's expression changed. The slight veneer of composure cracked. The controlled calm she had been projecting faltered. She felt insulted. Not just disrespected, but humiliated. In her mind, she was royalty. She had orchestrated the environment, the lighting, the decor, the introductions, all to create a private moment where she would be acknowledged and revered. And Kaitlyn had refused. That refusal was not just defiance. It was an exposure, a revelation, a reflection of the reality Meghan could not escape. She was not untouchable. She was not above accountability. She was, in this small townhouse, simply a woman, and someone refused to elevate her to the pedestal she had built. And that realization stung deeply. Her shoulders stiffened. Her jaw clenched. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Meghan's subtle breathing shifts, almost imperceptible to the untrained observer, betrayed the rising storm inside. Then came the accusation. Not overt, not shouted, but carefully framed, deliberate, and chilling. This is disrespectful, she said softly. You are disrespecting me. You do not understand what is at stake here. That moment changed the dynamic completely. It wasn't just about titles anymore. It was about identity. It was about validation. It was about someone failing to recognize the version of Meghan she desperately wanted to see reflected back. And here's what makes this boundary crossing so striking. It wasn't dramatic theater, it wasn't a spectacle for cameras, and it wasn't even for the house manager or staff present. It was for herself. Meghan needed to see herself acknowledged. And when the acknowledgement didn't come, the response was immediate, sharp, and revealing. She paced slightly, a controlled motion meant to display authority. Every small gesture, from the placement of her hands to the angle of her chin, reinforced the idea, I am the one in charge. The moment demanded compliance. Kaitlyn, sensing the escalation, maintained her composure. She did not mirror the intensity. She did not respond emotionally. She asked questions, sought clarification, and continued the interview professionally. Her calm presence highlighted Meghan's volatility, emphasizing the growing gap between expectation and reality. And Meghan felt it. The subtle signals, the psychological tension, the refusal to comply, all compounded. Meghan's internal narrative shifted. She was no longer in a controlled environment where her demands were met. She was confronted with a person outside her control, a person who would not reinforce her desired self-image. And Meghan could not allow that. She raised her voice slightly, not in anger, but in insistence. You must acknowledge me properly, she said. The insistence, the repetition, the framing as a requirement rather than request, elevated the interaction from a simple disagreement to a psychological power struggle. The staff around her shifted nervously. They understood that Meghan's escalation was not simply annoyance. It was an assertion of authority, a desperate attempt to reclaim dominance in an environment she had designed meticulously. And Kaitlyn did not yield. Her refusal was simple. She would not use the honorific. She would maintain professional standards. She would respect herself, her craft, and the principles of journalism. That refusal sent Meghan into an internal spiral, one that was subtle at first, then increasingly evident. The tightening of her posture, the controlled bite of her words, the occasional sharp intake of breath. These micro-expressions revealed a woman fighting to maintain composure while feeling her authority erode. It was a fascinating, almost clinical observation of human behavior in its rawest form. Because at this point, the conflict was no longer about etiquette, decorum, or professional standards. It was about self-preservation. Meghan's carefully constructed identity, built on titles, image, and recognition, was being questioned. And in her world, questioning is unacceptable. The words were simple, the gestures subtle, yet the underlying tension was explosive. And then came the subtle escalation, the moment that crossed the professional boundary completely. Meghan began to imply consequences. Not physical, not overtly legal, not threatening in the traditional sense, but psychological, social, and reputational. She suggested that failing to adhere to protocol reflected poorly on the journalist. That refusal to participate in her self-image would have repercussions, subtle but significant. Kaitlyn, as ever, remained professional. She acknowledged the concern, redirected the conversation, and continued her line of questioning, maintaining the integrity of the interview. But Meghan could not stop herself. She felt cornered. She needed to regain control. She needed recognition. And she needed compliance. So she delivered a statement that would define the rest of the encounter. I am not asking. I am telling. It is expected. It is respect. It is who I am. Those words were the boundary crossed. The psychological escalation that transformed a polite, controlled interview into a tense standoff. Kaitlyn did not flinch. She did not respond emotionally. She simply listened, maintained composure, and let Meghan reveal herself in full. Because Meghan's insistence, repetition, and escalating tone exposed her true vulnerability, a fear of being ordinary, a fear of losing validation, a fear that her carefully constructed identity might not hold up when challenged. And in that exposure lies the drama, the tension, the revelation. Because Meghan's behavior in that room was not just performative. It was defensive, protective, survival-driven. And that's what makes this moment so powerful. The boundary Meghan crossed. The line from polite assertion to insistence, from controlled composure to veiled intimidation, revealed the private truths of a public figure. It revealed the lengths she would go to protect her self-image. It revealed the intensity of her need for recognition. It revealed how fragile her constructed authority was when faced with defiance. And yet, the confrontation was far from over. Because as much as Meghan tried to reclaim control, as much as she asserted her dominance and reinforced her narrative, the one thing she could not control was Kaitlyn's refusal. And that refusal, simple and professional, would continue to ignite Meghan's frustration, pushing her further toward the meltdown that would define the rest of the interview. The lines had been crossed. Boundaries had been tested. Control had shifted. And what came next would escalate beyond subtle dominance, beyond polite insistence, into something no one in that townhouse had anticipated. Because Meghan Markle had reached the point where subtlety no longer worked. Imagine being in a room with someone who once held a crown, someone who has been trained to command attention, someone who expects compliance, not just courtesy, but reverence. Now imagine that person's authority being challenged by a single act. Refusing to use the title they insist is theirs. That's exactly what Kaitlyn Greenidge faced when she stepped into Meghan Markle's meticulously curated townhouse. And she held her ground. It might not sound like much on the surface. A journalist refusing to call someone by an honorific? It seems small, polite, professional. But in that room, it was monumental. Because Meghan had built this environment not just for a conversation, but as a stage where every gesture, every word, every introduction reinforced her self-image. She had orchestrated a scene where she expected recognition, deference, and compliance. And Kaitlyn refused all of it. That refusal was an act of quiet defiance. And in Meghan's mind, it was a direct challenge. When Meghan said, "It's Your Highness," she wasn't asking. She was asserting. She was testing. She was demanding acknowledgement for a role she believed was hers by right. But Kaitlyn, aware of the dynamics, simply said no. She maintained professional boundaries. She adhered to journalistic principles. She refused to participate in the fantasy. And that, more than anything, ignited the tension. Meghan's reaction was subtle at first. A tightening of the jaw, a narrowing of the eyes, a sharp inhale. These micro-expressions, almost imperceptible to anyone untrained in reading behavior, revealed the brewing storm. She was not angry yet, not overtly, but she was unsettled, disrupted, threatened. Her sense of control was slipping. Kaitlyn's calm presence only amplified this. She wasn't intimidated. She wasn't swayed. She didn't break. She simply observed and continued the interview as planned. Every question was measured, every response deliberate. Every time Meghan tried to insert herself into a position of authority, Kaitlyn maintained her professional distance. This refusal